Story 1. I was floored to learn that the idea of diamond engagement rings as an ancient, timeless tradition was invented by a De Beers marketing team in the 1930s. Story 2. McDonald's coffee lawsuit. That woman was seriously hurt, and I hate that I ever believed otherwise. Story 3. Go Ask Alice is a book presented as the diary of an anonymous girl who was addicted to drugs, published by her parents after her death. However, that was not true. It was allegedly created to encourage teenagers to accept an anti-drug message from a peer source rather than from an adult. It worked on me as a child. I remember how it resonated with me. Now it is listed as fiction. Story 4. I am not sure it is propaganda, but I used to believe that lemmings occasionally committed mass suicide. Thanks, Walt Disney, for proving this myth. Story 5. After Iraq invaded Kuwait, a young girl testified before the United States Congress. She said she had been in a Kuwaiti hospital, watching Iraqi soldiers remove premature babies from incubators, ship the incubators to Iraq, and leave the babies to die on the floor. A few years later, I learned the girl was the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to the United States. They had lived in New York City the entire time, so there was no way she could have seen what she testified to before the United States Congress. She had never even been to her own country. Turned out the event never happened. It was a ruse to motivate the United States Congress to vote for intervention. To this day, that woman is effectively a prisoner in her own home. Too many journalists tried to question her in public. Now she is not permitted to go out in public at all, and her husband refuses all interview requests. Story 6. Carrots improve night vision. Story 7. I feared that my Halloween candy would contain drugs and razor blades. Story 8. As a native Texan, I was taught that the Texas Revolution happened because of land rights. In reality, it was largely because slavery was illegal in Mexico and Texas settlers wanted slaves. That part is not often taught in school. Story 9. Different zones of the tongue correspond to different sensations, such as sweet, sour, and spicy. My middle school taught this, and I tested it with a warhead candy at lunch. I felt foolish for believing it even for a few hours. I do not know who convinced elementary schools to teach this as fact or why. It contradicted common sense and was easily disproved. Story 10. Paid closed-source software is more secure than free open-source software. Story 11. As a kid growing up in a small town in northern Ohio, a Union state in the Midwest, I learned that the Civil War was about states' rights, not slavery. While we did learn about slavery generally, it was not until I had one very assertive high school teacher that I discovered what specific rights those states were most concerned about. Story 12. I would say the propaganda about saturated fat and cholesterol. I grew up thinking foods like margarine and sugary cereals were healthier than an egg. Story 13. The war on drugs. In New York, you could get 15 years to life for a nonviolent first offense. No plea deals were possible. I grew up in a rural area and assumed drugs turned you into a murderer. That was a city problem. New York opened dozens of prisons in my area. Prison guard is the most common job in my family. If 85% go back to prison, it means the system does not work. Story 14. The Got Milk campaign and how it claimed to help build stronger bones. It turned out they had a surplus of milk and were looking for the best way to sell it to customers. Story 15. Saddam Hussein possessing weapons of mass destruction led to the invasion of Iraq, even though I did not fully believe it. The United States was so adamant he had them that it almost seemed like they gave them to him. The fact that 12 years later the United Nations said okay, maybe they did lie and left it at that was strange. Invasions of Middle Eastern countries were often based on lies aimed at deposing dictators. Libya's gold reportedly disappeared, Afghanistan being led by a former enemy, and Syria being ruled by someone claiming they are no longer a terrorist do not help the case. Story 16. Personal carbon footprints were created by the oil industry to shift the burden of decarbonization from the industry to consumers. Jaywalking was invented by the auto industry to stigmatize walking as a form of transportation. Story 17. The claim that Napoleon was short was English propaganda. He was actually of average height, yet the misconception persists. Story 18. The claim that we were saving the trees by switching to plastic bags was one of the biggest and most damaging lies of a generation. Story 19. Reduce, reuse, recycle was promoted as how we would save the planet. We need real, strong legislation that prioritizes the environment, not fluffy slogans, greenwashing, or blaming consumers or voters. Story 20. I genuinely believed in the United Nations post-war never again rhetoric as a preteen. I thought everyone had learned lessons from World War II and Nazi Germany and was appalled. Story 21. I was told the Gardasil vaccine would irrevocably harm my body when I was a teenager. My mother fully believed what her church said, and I was lucky a doctor discussed it with me again as an adult before the eligibility cutoff. Story 22. Breakfast is the most important meal of the day, which turns out to be one of the many successes of marketing propaganda. Story 23. Lawsuits are frivolous. Watch the documentary Hot Coffee. Story 24. I am from the South. I grew up believing in benevolent masters, that the North was unnecessarily aggressive, and that life was better for everyone, black and white, before the Civil War. In college, an African American history class triggered several existential crises, many crying spells, and the start of a deep distrust of the history I was taught in kindergarten through 12th grade. Story 25. Hawaii voluntarily became the 50th state of the United States. Story 26. Columbus was a neat guy who came over to see what was out there and made friends with the natives. I remember learning this in kindergarten. We drew pictures of our favorite of his 3 ships. Story 27. News reporters. I once gave an interview to a journalist about a topic I was representing. The published article shared almost nothing with what I actually said. They wrote the story they wanted and selected a few quotes from me to make it sound as if I had said what they intended. That is when I realized nothing I read in the news was true. Story 28. The civil rights movement solved racism in America. Good Lord, my public school education was bullshit in some respects. Story 29. When I was 4, around 1996, my mother told me, Al Gore wants to kill your baby sister in your mommy's tummy. What a gross, misguided thing to say to a 4-year-old, just because the man was pro-choice. It is one of my first memories, along with a severe storm in the same house. Story 30. Growing up in Texas, we were taught that the Texas Revolution was a righteous struggle against the evil Mexicans. It turns out that things were not quite so simple, and a large part of the revolution was the desire to continue owning slaves. Story 31. Drug abuse resistance education was an attempt to prevent children from using drugs. It turns out that a single power-tripping Los Angeles detective wanted to spy on families in schools, so he forced the program. Story 32. That rights exist. They are very easy to take away. We have privileges at best. Story 33. Hard work pays off. No, the reward is burnout and additional work. Story 34. Republicans claim to be better with the economy, but they are not. Their goal is to make the rich richer. Even Donald Trump has publicly said that the Democrats are better with the economy. Story 35. The American dream promises that if you work hard, you will have a house and a car. That idea is false. Hard work often makes your boss richer, not you. You can work 3 jobs and still not have enough to pay rent. Story 36. I was considering joining the military when I was fresh out of high school. After getting older and talking to people who served, I think 100% of my reasons for wanting to join were the result of military propaganda. The military will toughen you up, teach you confidence and discipline, and teach you to be a man. Now, time will do those things. Even without outside influence, you will have far more self-confidence and agency in your life at 26 than you had at 18, along with all the benefits of that. The military pays well. Now, not for what it will cost you. Even without formal education, you could become a plumber, electrician, garbage collector, or police officer and put yourself on a path to making far more money with less stress. And you can quit if you decide you do not like it or if you have an abusive coworker. People who date for money are attracted to men in uniform. Many people prefer partners who still have both their legs and who will not assault them during a post-traumatic stress disorder episode. You will be able to travel the world. You will either be stuck on a base in Alabama slowly getting lung cancer from diesel fumes or stuck on a base in Kuwait slowly getting lung cancer from diesel fumes. Save up and take a road trip to Florida or California instead. You will be able to serve your country. The current public stance of the United States federal government is that Jeffrey Epstein did not traffic anyone. I could do a lot more for my country by engaging in local mutual aid and social activist groups or by running for a position on a local school board. Story 37. I thought that getting a degree would automatically lead to financial stability. Now I have $37,000 in proof that says otherwise. Story 38. Watering your lawn will not make a meaningful difference in overall water use. We are made to feel guilty for taking short showers and conserving water, while corporations use millions of gallons of water without restriction. Story 39. Until I was 12, I believed that the United States was the only country in the world that gave its citizens human rights. I thought the rest of the world was a heavily authoritarian hellscape. I partly learned this at a Christian school. Story 40. I thought raw milk was healthy. I was never a crunchy mom type, but for some reason I was completely mistaken. I bought it from a respectable Amish family, but once I read the science explaining why it is dangerous, I felt embarrassed. Story 41. The government acts in our best interest. Story 42. They said that all Americans were evil and wanted to harm my country, Cuba. When I was a student, we were always told how horrible the American people were. I grew up believing this because at that time only prestigious doctors, people in high government positions, and some military personnel had access to the internet for private use with restrictions. With the widespread arrival of the internet in the country, I realized that the vast majority of Americans I have talked to are friendly. I even have a friend who lives in Chicago, and once a week we meet on a website called Jiggy to put together puzzles. Story 43. As a child of the 1980s, why was I not told how much was propaganda, especially in school? I often discovered that teachers oversimplified or even lied when the truth was inconvenient. Much of America's history since its founding was presented as either falsehoods or dramatized versions of darker truths. Story 44. The United States is special. I will leave it at that so I do not get carried away. My father was in the service and we were raised on a military base, very patriotic. We said the Pledge of Allegiance at home and attended flag ceremonies. I am ashamed to admit that I raised my children in a similar way. I was at least 30 before I understood that our rights, our way of life, and our freedoms exist in many other places, and that many countries surpass us on several measures of quality of life. I am also concerned about Christianity, specifically Christian nationalism. Story 45. When I got to high school, people offered me drugs or tried to pressure me into taking them. Story 46. Justice and karma exist. The law is fair. Things always go right in the end. Story 47. Trash is blamed on litterers, but that is a lie pushed by 50 years of marketing by the producers of plastic bottles, beer cans, polystyrene food containers, and other single-use items. France banned those items and fast food companies adapted without raising prices. Story 48. I thought climate change was a hoax. Then I read a book by one of the leading climate change deniers and realized he, a scientist, was talking nonsense. Well done, author. You persuaded me that you were wrong. Story 49. The triggered feminist meme was manipulative right-wing bullshit. Story 50. Hard work pays off. No, it does not. Hard workers are overworked. Story 51. California sucks. I travel there for work a couple of times a year and enjoy it. Story 52. That conservative meant proper family values. Now I know it means prison for women and children. Story 53. Breakfast is the most important meal of the day. Nope, just Kellogg trying to peddle garbage in a box. Story 54. A very significant portion of British history I learned growing up was fictionalized. Many teachers were quite conservative. Anything from about 1700 to 1914 was often glossed over unless it directly concerned Britain, and when the empire was discussed it was framed as if members were exploring other countries, ignoring the people who lived there or presenting Britain as doing them a favor. Most of the examples below were part of the required curriculum and reflected individual teachers' interpretation. I also had some excellent history teachers, and one gave a very useful class on propaganda that was actually part of the curriculum. Some things I remember being taught as fact. The potato famine and the Bengal famine were presented as completely unavoidable tragedies in which British governments had no influence until they bravely stepped in and stopped both. Anti-Irish discrimination was portrayed as purely an American phenomenon, and Irish people were said to have always been treated well in Britain. Britain was presented as always anti-slavery and uninvolved in the Atlantic slave trade. There was a partial truth in that Britain later became strongly anti-slavery, but the lessons omitted that the transatlantic slave trade had been profitable for Britain and that slavery and forced labor were widespread in British territories. The Caribbean was barely discussed, and we were given the impression that people working the sugar plantations were there of their own free will and well paid. Margaret Thatcher was presented as a global hero and described as the main reason Scotland is a good place to live today. This was pushed on a class largely composed of working-class Scottish children. Protestant-Catholic conflict in the United Kingdom and Ireland was described as a thing of the past that ended long before the First World War, despite ongoing tensions. One of the other history teachers was an ardent supporter of Rangers, the main Protestant football club in Scotland, and had strong opinions about Catholics. The creation of concentration camps during the Boer War and other atrocities were dismissed as myths and propaganda. We were told this was specifically Nazi propaganda during the Second World War. On the Allied bombing of Dresden, the class accepted contemporary German propaganda accounts as fact. We were not told that strategic bombing, while now often regarded as a war crime, was not considered one at the time. In another year, a class on the American Civil War presented explanations similar to the states' rights narrative common in parts of the American South. A friend only realized this was misleading many years later. In modern studies, we were taught that Saddam Hussein possessing weapons of mass destruction was a proven fact. A year-long course on the Soviet Union from 1917 to 1939 discussed the fall of the Tsarist regime and the factional politics before the Bolsheviks, but avoided discussing socialism or communism. The country was referred to as the Soviet Union rather than the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics because the latter term included the word socialism. I wrote many essays on Lenin and Stalin's economic policies without being taught why those policies were implemented. We also studied the rise of Nazi Germany without covering the ideology that drove it. Modern studies portrayed the Russian Federation as a normal and fair democracy and suggested Vladimir Putin could not be a dictator because he had stepped down as president at the time. Lessons on the suffragettes were relatively balanced, but universal suffrage was taught as if it had made men and women completely equal, implying an end to sexism. The Nazis were portrayed negatively overall, but the clean Wehrmacht myth was taught as fact, which I accepted for years. Story 55. Obama was a socialist, and his election was the end of America as a free society. I can testify firsthand that right-wing agitprop fucks you up. Story 56. Does alpha male count? It has spread through much of our culture and become an excuse for bad behavior in men. You are not an alpha. You are a jerk. Story 57. Propaganda is marketing. Propaganda, marketing, and psychology are different sides of the same coin. If you want to recognize what counts as propaganda, consider that everything can be propaganda. We are absolutely swimming in propaganda. Look around you. How many advertisements, taglines, headlines, and logos do you see? How many are you wearing? You hear it on the radio, watch it on screens, and see it on posters and stickers. Everything is a commercial, and the truth is framed. Story 58. America was the best country on the planet, good and true, made and run for the people. Story 59. I always thought the McDonald's coffee incident was a joke. When I was a kid, people asked, "How do you not know that coffee is hot?" But there was more to the story. Investigators concluded the coffee was hotter than it should have been. She initially asked only that McDonald's cover her medical expenses, and McDonald's refused. That amount, if I recall correctly, was less than $50,000. She went to court and won a large settlement. I viewed images of her injuries and concluded she was entitled to every penny. McDonald's could have acknowledged an error and taken care of their customer, but instead it ended up costing them about $20 million in 1980s money. If you doubt me, Search for images of her burns online and judge for yourself. Story 60. Sperm can travel through clothing and enter the body, potentially causing an unplanned pregnancy. Story 61. I believe that possums eat their weight in ticks every week. That is only true if ticks are the only available food source. That claim is propaganda from the people for the ethical treatment of animals. I still love possums, but it is harder to convince other people who know the truth. Story 62. The Pledge of Allegiance was patriotic. It's actually brainwashing. Story 63. When Fox News first appeared, their slogan was fair and balanced. I got my news from other networks, so I never watched the news station until it was on the bar television at work. I still paid little attention to it. News is news, I thought. Then I noticed people reacting to the news differently than I had before. They were more adamant, more certain of their opinions, and angrier than they had ever been. They were the same people I had known for years, but they had changed. I was having a shift drink with one of the servers, who was also a teacher, and I pointed out the new behavior. She pointed to the television and said it was Fox News. She said they say some people say instead of identifying who said it, and that is not what journalists do. She pointed out other things too, but that stuck with me and helped me see it in a different light. Thanks, Joe, and teachers are awesome. Story 64. Those lawsuits, such as the case of the woman who was severely burned by hot McDonald's coffee, were frivolous money grabs. Story 65. Banks lend you their money. I learned this recently, and it changed my view of finance. I had believed banks kept a balance sheet funded by initial capital. A company might found a bank with $1 million. If you go to the bank for a loan of $10,000, the bank lends it to you and charges interest because it supposedly risks losing its money. You might repay $12,000. If you fail to repay, the law comes after you because the bank is down $10,000. Customers open accounts, and by depositing their money at the bank, they earn interest and share in the profit from loans. But this is not how it works. Banks are empowered by law to create money. When you borrow $10,000, no money is taken from a pot and transferred to your account. The bank creates $10,000 that did not exist before and gives it to you. The bank does not take risk on this created money. Banks need large amounts of capital mainly as a defense against runs, when many people withdraw their deposits and the bank faces liquidity risk. In theory, all these balances are supposed to add up, but in practice they do not. At every step of the process, the debt is conceptual. When you repay the loan, the principal ceases to exist, but the interest does not, so the real money involved is the interest you pay. Story 66. Pork is not red meat. There was a major push by the pork industry to reclassify pork as white meat because red meat causes higher rates of colon cancer. Story 67. This is the story of the Alamo and Texas independence. In 7th grade in Texas, students learn state history, including how Texans fought Mexican forces and won. The real story is that many Texans fought to preserve slavery. Mexico's only rule for American settlers on its land was that slavery was not permitted, which contributed to the conflict over Texas. Story 68. Claims that the media report the news without bias are false. Portraying China as a boogeyman and the West as the good side in conflicts is misleading. Story 69. The government cares about its people. However, corporations are the only things that matter. Story 70. I believed in the cryptocurrency industry, only to realize later that it was mostly deceptive American marketing and scams. Story 71. People thought things would improve in the 21st century. It's just more of the same. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.